Let me get this to cover my slide. Anyway, I was prefacing my comments with a statement of some diffidence here, because the leading father of the field of benefit cost analysis in education is George Psacharopoulos, and I want to acknowledge that, but I must say it makes me a little nervous to speak to the topic. We have two topics, Elina and I. Elina's recent graduate of the School of Public Health here and is currently young professional at the World Bank, so she'll be in Washington for a while, but she's traveling and couldn't join us today, or she would have been giving this talk. Two objectives. One is a substantive objective around the economics of education and the economic returns to education. And the second topic is one that we're developing as part of this reference case, a standardized way of generating sensitivity analyses to allow much greater comparability of studies to be accumulated over time, and perhaps even to look back at some studies and bring them into this format. It's not to argue that we have a correct set of values of key parameters. We want to be suggestive of reasonable values, but the individual analyst will need to respond to the needs of the decision makers that they're working for. But rather, if they, in addition to responding to those needs, undertake these standardized analyses, that will allow us to accumulate results over time in a way that we otherwise would not do. And my own observation is that there's a great deal of important non-comparability in the BCA literature that really creates problems. So those are our 2 points. Let me turn to the basic approach of benefit cost analysis in education. It's to start with these age earnings profiles, and these particular age earning profiles, or the one in blue, is an average age earnings profile for low and middle income countries that was generated from the Brown Commission on Financing Education and in a parallel paper with George. So the blue is from George and some of his colleagues. It's pretty up to date. The red is an estimate of the consequences of one additional year of education for that age earnings profile. So the benefit stream over time for one additional year of education is simply the difference in those two curves. You combine that with a cost at the beginning, and you generate, in this literature, almost entirely internal rates of return. I used to think that this was not a very good way to go. That the right way to think about things was benefit cost ratios or present value of net benefits. But since we seem to have so much trouble with the discount rate, the emergence of an internal rate of return as the rate of return that equalizes the present value of benefits and costs may be a much easier number for decision makers to use. So what Elina and I and our colleagues have done is to try to look at the value of education for reducing mortality and add that to the value expressed in the difference between those two curves to get a larger monetary value each year for that 1 year investment in education. And I won't go into the issues of how we generate the effect of 1 year of education. There's a long history of the relationship between education and mortality. All I would say is we've done it with up-to-date data and very conservatively. And what does that look like? That looks like these two curves, and the blue curve is where the value, the VSL or the VSMU that we generate is not adjusted for age. And just to read what that curve means, in that middle section where it's fairly high, there are benefits associated with reduced child mortality. So this is education, 1 more year of education for a woman. And so while that woman is of childbearing years, it reflects lower mortality rates for her children in that period. And that, it's arbitrary, but we end that at 40, age 40. The right side of the curve from 45 on, or actually all along the curve, there is a measured effect of education on adult mortality rates. And what we've done from those measured effects of education on child and adult mortality rates is assign a value to reduction of mortality through exactly the methods we've been talking about. And we've done that for a variety of parameters. So the two curves just show variation with one of the parameters. That is the parameter of how you would vary the VSL or the VSMU with age. So if it's different value for different ages, you get the red curve which weights children more heavily. And for adjustment for age, where a child's death counts for more than an adult's death, you get the blue curve. So that's the basic structure of the analysis we're doing. So we're going to add this graph to the difference between the two graphs on the preceding slide and call that the benefits, and we'll have some sensible, I hope, estimate of cost, both the cost of the student's time and the dollar cost of provision of the education. So this is a much simpler thing than it looks, to be sensitive to some of the comments about complexity, some of the very sensible comments about complexity in the last session. All this is just the present value on the top of the total benefits, wage benefits plus the value of mortality change, and the bottom is costs, and the C1 and C2 are just the cost of student time, and the other is the direct cost of education. And the earnings value is separated from the health improvement value of that additional year of education. And so that's the benefit cost ratio, the health inclusive benefit cost ratio. And this is the more standard way of expressing results within the economics of education literature, as I said, the internal rate of return. So it's simply equilibrating the benefits, choosing the discount rate that makes benefits and costs equal. So we had an example this morning in someone's discussion of Esther Duflo's returns to education in Brazil, where she was estimating returns to investing in new school facilities at 8 to 10%, the internal rate of return. And that, I think most people would agree, sounds pretty good. There was quite a bit of discussion with Jim and Lisa this morning about how one would adjust or not adjust the VSL to income ratio as a function of differences across countries in income. So I won't repeat that. But we have two variants, basically the constant, no variation. So it's the same VSL to Y ratio for countries of all incomes. And we used an elasticity of 1.2, not 1.4. We're waiting for the final agreement on parameters to be using to finalize our paper, but we used an income elasticity of 1.2. And valuation of varying with age. we can have a VSL that is within a country at a given time, independent of the age of the person who dies, or we can have it be dependent on the proportional to the remaining life expectancy, to life expectancy at age of death. And those are pretty different numbers. Or we can have it 1,000 different things. We heard of an inverse U-shaped curve, things. And so we chose those two as important because most of the cost-effectiveness literature in health uses constructs like the Dowley or Qualley that have the YLL, the years of life lost in them, and those are essentially life expectancy at the age of death. So that's standard in the cost-effectiveness literature. The cost-benefit literature, I have been increasingly learning, while not rigid on this point at all, tends to be much more sympathetic to something that looks fairly constant across ages. So we took those two extremes. So the point that I'm now switching to, I'll talk about the change in our results on the internal rate of return in just a moment. But the point that I'm now turning to is to say that if we have, as Jim talked about briefly this morning, a standardized approach where we look at two key values of the income, the VSL to income ratio, and two reasonable approaches to addressing how the value of a death averted varies with age. I think these two are the reasonable ones. Then we get different numbers, and we could get very, very different numbers for some things. But at least we would be able to compare the analyses for these four parameters in a consistent way. So that's what we've tried to do. We'll change the parameters when we have a better sense of what a reasonable set of parameters for the sensitivity analysis will be much later in this project. This shows just the present value of the mortality benefits as a function of whether we make the VSL income elastic or not, and our base VSL to income ratio is 130, perhaps a bit high, but somewhere in the range. For a lower middle income country, and by the way, all the numbers I've talked about so far are for lower middle income countries. For that value of income, I think with an elasticity of 1.2, the VSL to income ratio is somewhere between 80 and 90. So this shows simply how our results, and I'll end with this, how our results vary with respect to those two elements of the sensitivity analysis. Taking the VSL to income ratio of 130, we get, if the value of income is, if the value of the VSL is income dependent, we get a 10% internal rate of return and 13% if it's constant at 130. And there's variation with respect to the year of life loss assumption on the right there. This shows much the same issue. These are about a third higher. These benefit cost ratios are about a third higher, the internal rates of return, than those generated without including the value of mortality reduction. So it's a quantitatively significant but not overwhelming change, qualitative change in the results. Let me just, anyway, the last was a slide showing sensitivity to discount rates. And so an aspect, of course, of the benefit cost ratio is the benefit cost ratio isn't a ratio, it's a function of R, whereas the internal rate of return is just a number. It makes it a little bit simpler. Thanks.
Thanks, Lynn. Great timing. So now we're going to turn to Brad Wong, and Brad is going to present a paper he wrote with Peter Orazem on stunting.
Happening automatically. All right, thank you, everyone. Today I want to talk to you about stunting and walk you through a benefit cost analysis looking at the implementation of a package of interventions that could reduce the prevalence of stunting in Haiti, which is where the Copenhagen Consensus has been working this year and last year. Basically what this case study is trying to elucidate is bringing together all the bits and pieces that you've heard today, all the different ways to value mortality, morbidity. There'll be a little bit about discounting, but not a lot, and see how all of these different approaches affect the eventual results and also affect the policy outcome. So just a little bit of background. So what is stunting? And I pulled this graphic from the Gates Notes blog, which is, I think, quite an iconic, now quite an iconic picture, trying to depict what stunting actually means. And it's pretty simple. It's being too short for one's age. And in this particular picture, you have a group of Tanzanian children. I think they're 9 years old, and they're standing up against a wall, and that line that's above them is the median medium height for 9-year-olds across the world, and clearly they're shorter than that, and they're significantly shorter than that. And that little green box there, if you can read it, basically says that when Bill and Melinda Gates went to this village in Tanzania, they couldn't find a child that was as tall as that line. And there are places in Tanzania, in Bangladesh, in rural India, and perhaps even in parts of Haiti where you will have children who don't who aren't as tall as they should be for their age. So that's so what causes stunting? It's caused by undernutrition and high levels of infection in the first 1,000 days of life. We know from the literature that it leads to an increased risk of illness in childhood, increased risk of dying before the age of 5. It leads to delayed cognitive development, lower productivity in adulthood, and potentially higher risks of disease in adulthood. And we'll see in a second that all of these different problems with stunting, the effects of stunting, mean that when you try and reverse it, you have a very interesting and nice case for conducting these sensitivity analyses around the different valuation approaches. So before we turn to I just want to point out that stunting in Haiti, according to the latest demographic and health survey, is around 22%. That was done in 2012. So the question, just first of all, is why stunting and why Haiti? I think it's no secret that Haiti has a lot of challenges, and it doesn't have a ton of resources in which to address those challenges. So potentially the reduction of stunting could be an effective use of resources. There's a bit of evidence out there that suggests that it is one of the best buys across all of development. A recent review suggests that the median benefit cost ratio of stunting prevention is 18, which is extremely high. It's a good buy in anyone's books. And multiple rounds of the Copenhagen Consensus exercises, things that we've done in 2008, 2012, something that we did for the post-2015 development gender and exercise that we did in Bangladesh, have consistently put reduction of stunting towards the top, if not the top intervention, of which development agencies or governments can focus on if they want to be effective with the limited resources that they have. It's also useful as a case study for this exercise that we're all here for today, And the reason is there's three types of benefits. There's avoided morbidity, there's avoided mortality, and there's lifetime productivity gains. There's also short and long-term benefits. The benefits of avoided mortality and morbidity tend to be concentrated for children, and that happens obviously in the short term with this intervention. And then there are lifetime productivity benefits that occur many, many years in the future. So we can test the effects of discounting as well on the results. So it's in total, it's kind of a nice little case study because there's all of these moving parts, and we can see that if we change one thing, or if we take one set of assumptions, how does that affect the result? And we can do it for for at least 4 different things. And the last part of why Haiti is that, well, as I said before, Copenhagen Consensus has been doing work in Haiti this year and last year. And what I think is interesting is when we get to the end result of this, we'll have a number, and that benefit cost ratio is about 2 for this intervention. But once you have that number, it's not very clear what you're meant to do with it, unless you have other benefit cost analyses that tell you, hey, for other different interventions in education and health and nutrition, what are their effectiveness? And it allows you to test the relative, to anchor the result within a broader framework of other interventions and other effective uses or potentially ineffective uses of your limited resources. So what exactly is the intervention? This comes from a paper written by Butter and colleagues, published in The Lancet in 2013. The intervention is actually a package of interventions. It's 10 nutrition interventions directed at mothers, pregnant women, and children, and then one intervention directed at the whole population, which is salt iodization. And according to that particular paper, and based on epidemiological modeling in that paper, they assert that it'll probably reduce stunting by a 5th. We take that result, result from that paper, and then apply it to the Haitian context. And you'll see here on the left on the right-hand side, the brown bars indicate the level of stunting before the intervention, and the blue bars indicate the level of stunting after the intervention. And we've broken that down into different severities of stunting. I should just probably make a little point here about how stunting is measured, because it'll show up in slides that come after. But essentially, stunting is measured height for age, and it's usually expressed as standard deviations away from what is normal. So when you see a height for age Z score of -1, that child is 1 standard deviation away from what is normal, -2 standard deviations, etc. The severe stunting is 3 standard deviations shorter than what is normal. Moderate stunting is between 2 and 3, and mild stunting is between 0 and 1. So I'll go into the first. Yes. Yep.
You're showing 47% of the people are previously stunted.
Good question. So stunting, depending on which audience you're looking at, tends to focus on the summation of severe and moderate stunting. Anyone less than 2. Mild stunting is between 0 and 1. So between 0 and 1 and 2. Sorry. Yeah. And in the way that when we calculate the mortality and morbidity benefits, there is also a benefit associated with prevention of mild stunting. That's why we included it here. So this is a slide that talks about how we calculated the avoided mortality benefits. And the left-hand side of the slide is a graph from a paper written by Orazem and colleagues in 2013. And essentially what they did was they did a pooled analysis of 10 prospective studies, I think in Africa, Latin America, and across Asia, of the effects of stunting on all-cause mortality for under 5 children. And essentially what this shows is that as you increase the severity of stunting, the risk of dying before your 5th birthday also increases, and increases quite significantly. So at the extreme, oops, no, I do the light. Anyway, doesn't matter. At the extreme of the severe stunting, where the height rate Z score is less than 4, let's say at -4, then the risk of dying is 10 times that of a child that's not stunted. So we take this 5 minutes. So we take this this evidence and these results, and then apply it to the Haitian-specific global burden of disease data, and then we are able to calculate the mortality reductions. If you were to apply this to a given birth cohort, the 2017 birth cohort, how many children would avoid dying across the next 5 years? So 2017, 2018, 2019, etc., 2021. And clearly, most of the avoided deaths occur in the first year of life because most of the deaths occur in the first year of life. And roughly, that's about 2 lives saved per 1,000. So once we have those results, we then apply all the different approaches that have been suggested by the methods papers, 170 times GNI per capita, 80 by GNI per capita PPP. These lead to value of statistical lives in the Haitian context of 7.6 million Haitian gourds for approach 1, 3.6 million Haitian gourds for approach 2. We also use an approach which tries to, instead of valuing the lives, we value the years of life lost using VSLY, and they give the results there, as you can see. Got to move quickly. So what are the results? For avoided mortality, we can see that the real difference in the results comes from your choice of estimate from which you do the benefit transfer. If you're taking the higher estimate, that's 170 times GNI per capita. Obviously, you have much higher avoided mortality benefits. If you take the low estimate, it's about half that. The choice of discounting, there's nothing special here about these 3 rates, 3%, 5%, or 12%. These were just default numbers that we use for the Haiti Priorities project. And the other result from this is that the use of valuing like YLL, so the years of life loss, as opposed to just valuing the whole life, doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. I'll move over this pretty quickly. This is avoided morbidity. So we take the same approach, we use the same hazard ratios for mortality from the elephant paper and then apply it to morbidity. We take the burden of morbidity for Haitian children from the global burden of disease and calculate the avoided cases of illness. That title should be 1755 cases of illness per 1,000 children reached. Most of the avoided morbidity comes from avoiding cases of diarrhea, and we use 3 approaches to value these cases. Again, all of these come from the methods paper. One is to see if there's another place in which you can draw a willingness to pay estimate, and we use a study from rural China that suggests that in the Haitian context, avoiding a case of diarrhea would, Haitian parents would be willing to pay 715 Haitian gourds per case of illness. We also convert the cases of years lost we convert the cases of illness into YLDs and value each YLD at the VSLY. And we use that for both the high and low VSL estimates, 7.6 million gourds and 3.6 million gourds. Here are the results from avoided morbidity. The difference in the results here in terms of like percentages are about as large as for avoided mortality. So you're getting benefits that are about twice as big as in approach 2A relative to, say, approach 1. But because avoided morbidity is as big a component of the benefits in the absolute grand scheme of this intervention, it's not. It doesn't make as much of a difference. The last type of benefit is is lifetime productivity. And we know from several studies of where individuals were given nutrition interventions and then subsequently followed up over the course of their life, that the prevention of stunting can have very significant consumption effects in the future. And I guess the seminal study in this genre, the one that's been applied the most, is this study by John Hodnott, who followed a group of Guatemalan children over the course of their lives. And there's a few variants of this study, but essentially the answer that comes out of this is that if you are stunted, there's a 66% reduction in your lifetime consumption. And on the left-hand side there, we have the somewhat akin to the age learning process that Lynn was talking about here, but instead of talking about years of education, we're talking about being stunted or not stunted. Let me just sum up quickly, because I have to. So we put all of these together, and we see that what's a takeaway with all of these numbers? Productivity benefits are significant, but it really depends on discounting. If you have a really high discount rate, clearly what happens 20, 30 years in the future isn't going to matter as much as what happens right now. Mortality avoided benefit. If we take the middle scenario, which is 5%, the mortality avoided benefit and the productivity benefit are about equally as important for this intervention. And we end up with a benefit cost ratio of 2.4 and a net benefit of about 18,000 gauds per child. The last thing I want to point out, and this is, I think, really important for some of the things that we've been talking about today. What is the effect of the different valuation approaches on the policy result? And what I presented here, I've taken the central estimate, which is 18,000 gauds per net benefit per child, and then tried to vary one component. And the first component is the discount rate. You can see that there's quite a large variation, high and low. The second one is the effect of the intervention on stunting. We've taken the 20% that comes from the Buddha paper. We've taken the high and the low of the 95% confidence interval and just flow that through. And again, the effects are quite large. The third column is the effect of stunting on health and productivity, and we've taken the 95% confidence intervals of Olafin and the 95% confidence intervals of the Hodnott paper, and taken the extremes of that, and those are the results there. And again, quite a large range. And then the last one, this will change because there's been updates to the methods papers, but the last one shows that if you take all of the different permutations and computations and choose the options that maximize the health benefits, and then choose all of the options that minimize the health benefits, you get a variation of around 50% on high and low relative to the central estimate. So I don't know how these results will evolve because we obviously have to do them, but I think it suggests that the choice of methods is less, or at least about the same as other sources of uncertainty when thinking about the results of these policies. Sorry, thank you.
Thanks, Brad. I was about to give you a hug to make you stop. Using David. Thanks, Brad. I was about to give you a hug to make you stop. Using David DeFerrante's strategy. Now we're going to turn to the discussants part of the session. And I'd like to invite Anil Deolalikar for the first presentation.
Thank you. Since we have 4 discussants here, I thought I would sort of basically, and we have limited time and we want to go through all 4 discussants, I thought I would focus my comments on the paper by Pradhan and Jamison. And I'm sure some of the other discussants will take up Brad's paper in more detail. So my overall comments on Dean's presentation is that this is a very important paper, and the main innovation of the paper is the inclusion of child and adult mortality benefits, in addition to the standard earnings benefits that we normally see in most education BCA context. The paper also clearly articulates the importance of sensitivity analysis in BCA in 3 different dimensions. One was, of course, and Dean presented this, the evaluation of mortality reductions at different ages, at different country income levels, and then finally sensitivity to the discount rate assumption. Another neat result in the paper was the comparability of BCA estimates to cost effectiveness estimates in a particular case where mortality reductions are valued independently of income in the BCA approach. As I said earlier, the paper is comprehensive, very thorough. It's a good sort of application of the reference BCA approach. I have really no quibbles with the approach adopted by the authors or their execution of the approach. That said, I have a few minor sort of points on the paper, more of which they are more of sort of questions of clarification, and then I'll raise a few other larger substantive issues. One is the issue of schooling. Is it really schooling or female schooling that the authors are talking about in this paper? Much of the mortality benefit of schooling comes from female schooling, not overall schooling, as we clearly state. But I believe, I may be wrong about this, Dean, but I believe the authors have added the mortality reduction-based benefit of female schooling to the wage returns from all, basically male and female schooling, to obtain their overall BCA. So I wonder whether the 2 components of the total benefits, the total returns, the earnings component and the mortality reduction component are comparable in that sense. This is normally not a problem, except there are a number of studies from LMICs, including a couple that I have done myself, that suggest that there are large differences in the earnings returns to schooling. And so if that's the case, it's probably better to use the female returns to schooling, or at least have make some reference to that. The other point is a relatively minor point. The authors include the mortality reducing benefits of increased female schooling, and of course these are very significant. But there's reason to expect that the child morbidity and nutritional benefits of additional female schooling could also be quite large, and that, of course, is not included by the authors. Is it possible to borrow estimates from Brad's study on the benefit of reducing child stunting and sort of add them onto your current estimates, Dean? This is a case where the 2 case studies could be interdependent in some sense. What are some of the ways in which both BCA in education and sensitivity analysis of BCA estimates could be extended? First, there is also an additional dimension of heterogeneity in the estimated impact of female schooling, both on earnings as well as on under 5 and adult mortality. Let me sort of elaborate. There's a wide range of estimates of the earnings returns to schooling, sometimes even within a country, with these estimates varying markedly depending upon how you estimate the returns. And of course, George is here, who spent a good bit of his career on estimation of returns to schooling. But these estimates sort of vary widely depending on whether the estimates control for innate ability, family background, schooling quality, other sort of dimensions of unobserved heterogeneity. Likewise, there exist multiple estimates of the impact of female schooling on child mortality. In other words, context matters. So in the SSA, does it make sense to add this 4th dimension of sensitivity by allowing for different schooling impact estimates, a low estimate, a middle estimate, and a high estimate? Maybe the authors did that already, and I may have missed it. This was a dense paper, and I mostly sort of read it late in the night. So I may have missed it. It really worked very well in keeping me awake for the whole night. How you increase schooling years also matters. The paper focuses on the benefits and costs of increasing female schooling from 6 years on average to 7 years. But it matters, and this may be a relatively minor point, it matters how you increase that one additional year of schooling. There's some very recent research in Brazil which indicates that if you have children start school a year earlier at the age of 6 instead of 7, Brazil had a sweeping policy reform, which again has been used in a policy experiment by where they had a plan to sort of increase schooling, but they started children in primary school 1 year earlier. But that impact can be very different from keeping a child in school 1 year longer, that is until age 14 instead of 13. And so there's sort of heterogeneity. I'm almost done. I realize such detail is beyond the scope of the current paper, but as individual BCA country estimates are prepared, it is important to keep this complexity in mind. By the way, I should mention to the chair that I was, Lisa actually gave me a few additional minutes because I was supposed to present an additional level of complexity. So, may I borrow that minute or two? I have permission from the boss. This part I already spoke this morning, so I'm not going to go over this. Studying impact is on experiments. But the last point I want to make is regarding calculating impact on lifetime. Remember, Lisa, you asked me to talk a little bit about this. This is a more general point because many case studies, BCA studies, value lifetime production benefit. But lifetime production is not clearly identified and uniformly sort of used because at various points, different studies use different measures of lifetime production impact. On the one hand, you have some studies that look at wage rates in the paid labor market. Other studies use earnings in the paid labor market. Yet other studies use farm profits for self-employed farmers. You have people using income. You have people using consumption. So there's sort of no uniformity in how you define lifetime production. And it matters. For instance, an intervention could increase an individual's labor productivity and therefore his market wage rate, but the individual might cut back on his hours worked, assuming that there's a backward bending labor supply curve, in which case the effect on earnings might be muted. So if you are a researcher who is capturing the impact of the intervention on earnings and not on the hourly wage rate, you could be underestimating the productivity intervention. Likewise, an intervention might increase income, but some of that income could be diverted by households to savings, in which case research looking at consumption effects might underestimate the production impact of the intervention. So there are many ways in which substitution could occur, including inter-household substitution, where an intervention increases an individual's income, but that prompts another household member within related to that reference individual to come back on her work hours. And so if you look at household income, that wouldn't capture the same productivity effect as if you looked at the effect on individual income. So it's not clear what correct measure we need to use. It all goes back to a point that someone had raised, which is, are you looking at the impact of an intervention on labor productivity, gross output in the economy, or on some measure of health? So in conclusion, this is an excellent case study that highlights the importance of both SSA and BCA estimates, as well as including non-wage benefits. An important finding that I found quite intriguing and quite striking is that almost half of the total benefit of schooling comes from the mortality reduction aspect of increased schooling, as opposed to the traditional earnings-based return. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite Lynn Karoly.
So I will confess on behalf of our panel that we also did not coordinate. So you may be hearing some common themes as we go through our 4 sets of remarks. I wanted to offer first some general comments. First of all, I'd like to commend Lisa and Jim and their colleagues in bringing case studies into this project because I think it's very instructive to see what the recommendations look like in practice. So what the implications are in actually applying the kind of guidance that would come out of the reference case. But I also think that it serves to raise some other issues that should be kept in mind. And I hope my comments might point to some of those that would be relevant for the reference case project to keep in mind as they build out what the final product is. Ultimately, my understanding of the reference case project is to focus on valuing outcomes in low and middle income countries, looking at interventions, the measured impacts, how do we value those outcomes, and particularly in the context of health-related outcomes, mortality, morbidity. And ultimately, all of the issues that we talked about earlier today about how, what's the value of statistical life, all of those parameters are at play in these applications. So rather than focusing on those issues, I want to touch on some other topics. I think these 2 examples serve to illustrate that the kinds of data and information challenges that were talked about earlier this morning that analysts are going to confront in working on benefit cost analysis in these settings is going to be very much the reality. You're not going to find estimates, for example, for Haiti and the value of statistical life. And so coming back to these values that we have from other countries, whether US or elsewhere, and the need to make adjustments to account for these other settings is going to be the reality. So I'm sort of taking that as given, and that the guidance here that's coming out of the reference case analysis, is going to be behind the estimates that we're seeing. So I think as 2 case study examples, as exercises, I found the 2 papers in this session to be very well executed. They're very clear. Ultimately, the first paper on stunting is focused on a bundle of nutritional interventions. I think one thing that's important that will come up in other comments, that this is an intervention that has not been done yet in Haiti, is my understanding. And in fact, even this bundle of interventions has not necessarily been implemented together. This is taking separate studies. I think there's 10 different interventions that are considered separate studies, maybe in some cases, some of them together, but then trying to understand or forecast what the impacts will be from doing a set of interventions collectively. Not only that, but applying it in the context. And so we can think of this as a kind of perspective benefit cost analysis and intervention that's not one that we have actually implemented and measured impacts, and therefore retrospectively can look at benefits and costs with this kind of forecast approach. In the case of the education paper, I really view this as not strictly, I view it less as a benefit cost analysis than as an exercise in determining the shadow price of additional year of schooling. Because what the paper doesn't do is tell you what's the intervention that gets you that additional year of schooling. So I think of it as if you could increase year of schooling by 1 year, and make the point that it's whether that year might be at the beginning of the schooling history, it might be at the end. Then if we see these impacts, whatever that intervention is, it increases by half a year, 2 years. This is a paper that would give us an estimate that we could use to adapt as a value. Incorporates both the productivity effects, the effects to the labor market, but also the non-productivity, the outside of the labor market effects. and in this case, focusing on aspects related to mortality and morbidity. And I would point out that most of my work is in the U.S. context. There is a history of accounting for beyond simply labor market impacts of increases in education as a result of interventions. And that comes from a long literature in the U.S. that has tried to look at these non-market benefits of schooling, whether that's in the form of increased health, improved outcomes for children, so the next generation, improved consumer behavior, so you're a more efficient consumer, and so on. So there is a history of doing that, and much of that literature is sort of settled in the sense of the standard value to attach to an additional year of schooling as effectively doubling the benefit that you see in the labor market to capture these non-market benefits as well. So just as a reference, in the U.S., it's believed that those broader benefits are at least as large as the labor benefits, and so that sort of 2 times factor is typically used in U.S. benefit cost analysis. One issue that I think is going to be something to confront is doing these kinds of benefit cost analyses, bringing in aspects related to mortality and morbidity, and particularly valuing them with the VSL. Do we have to worry about double counting of benefits? What's ultimately captured in that VSL measure, and are there aspects, for example, of labor market productivity effects, or if we're adding in other domains of benefits? And this is an issue that also is quite common in benefit cost analysis because we are trying to capture all the benefits. But in many cases, we don't observe all of those benefits. And so we're trying to then create linkages between what we do observe and anticipated impacts in other areas. We have to be careful that we may be ending up using multiple pathways to get values that ultimately are capturing some of the same effects or the same impacts. And so I think that's something that, again, I would put on the list maybe for the reference case to be thinking about as an issue for analysts to consider. Another point I think comes out of these examples, and particularly the paper on stunting, is that while much reference case analysis is focusing on these values and the values to morbidity and mortality and the uncertainty around that, and setting a standardized sensitivity analysis, there are other sources of uncertainty to account for. That includes, not going beyond the valuation, but the magnitudes of the intervention from the policy itself, and whether or not we have a retrospective analysis where there may be statistical uncertainty because we've estimated effects from an RCT. But with the prospective, we also have the possibility of greater uncertainty because we're applying impact estimates from one country to another, from one population to another, from one country to another. And so those sources of uncertainty may come into play. And I think the nice example that comes out of the stunting paper is that you actually see the sources of uncertainty there associated with the confidence interval around the initial impact estimate from the interventions to stunting, and then the uncertainty from stunting to estimates of morbidity and mortality. Those levels of uncertainty are even larger than what we see just because of the valuation range that is being applied here. So ultimately, these are sources of uncertainty that need to be accounted for. And I think just tied to that is, what is the role of a standardized sensitivity analysis versus other methods for accounting for uncertainty? Like Monte Carlo estimation, for example, when we know something about a parameter in standard error, we have the possibility of actually modeling that as opposed to just picking the ranges. Because ultimately, you're going to run out, you're going to get to the point where if you're trying to do these kind of standardized ranges on lots of parameters and all the permutations, you're going to get to a lot of these different kinds of sensitivity analyses. So these are my recommendations in terms of the reference case, is thinking about issues about double counting, acknowledging these multiple sources of uncertainty and approaches for accounting for that uncertainty. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. Now I'd like to invite Roger Perman.
Thank you very much.
So I'd like to thank Lisa for inviting me to be a discussant today. And as with Anil, I also had a sleepless night preparing my responses, compounded by the fact that I that day been delivered with a new young puppy. So there's a kind of big opportunity cost on my time that evening. So I focused pretty much on the first paper. The paper I chose to look at was this one, and I pretty much just quickly skim read it. That's all I could find the time to do. When I looked at this paper, I was looking at it pretty much in the sense of what things about it struck me as being interesting issues. Not so much problematic, but just things that made me think and that were perhaps non-standard. So in this paper, it's a very strong paper. It does all the brief. It fits the brief very well, I think, of being a standardized case study. It makes excellent use of the available evidence. It seems to be pretty much in practice with what the methodology papers are proposing. It uses this standardized it uses a good set of benefit estimates. The first thing I think which struck me was this VSL of 9 million for the USA. We've talked about this several times this morning. Indeed, one of the papers this morning seems to recognize that 9 million may be something of an outlier and implied that it might not be, that we might wish to go for a somewhat lower level. I don't really want to spend too much on that, but it did strike me that if we normalize things around this 9 million figure, we're talking about evaluation of life in a context where all these assumptions about rationality and conformity to standard rules can work well. There's large amounts of discretionary income. And I'm not quite sure whether we should be thinking about using another country more towards the middle of the LMIC context as being a kind of reference case. I wasn't totally persuaded by the argument that because we know more, we've got stronger results for the USA. That in itself might be a good reason for choosing that as a reference base. Interesting things there. I found it interesting to see the fact that the interesting gender differences in the impact of stunting. I noticed that the authors of this paper made a comment. I think I've summarized it correctly here, that although the stunting study here did have very high benefit to cost ratio, it wasn't as high as some other items that might be available in that context. That, of course, gets into the question of a paper beginning to sort of talk about whether other things are better than this thing. So it's probably not really wise to raise that kind of issue in this context. There was a case where, for one particular thing, the authors make the point that the context matters hugely in regard to the efficacy of the intervention, but still used the figure they chose, the central figure, and adopted a sort of higher and a lower level as being the bounds for sensitivity. I sometimes think a lot of these things a lot of the numbers that are presented, first of all, are our best guesses under the assumption things work well, and that there's a sort of an asymmetrical distribution here, and that we should be willing to accept the fact that sometimes we only want to look at the downside, not the upside, when we're doing cost benefit, when we're doing sensitivity studies. I found the choice of 3, 5, and 12 a bit arbitrary in this paper. I read the paper, I didn't see the slides at the time, and the fact that 12% was recommended by a country official struck me as being a little bit weird. But this has been a big issue that we've been we've been confronting today. Where should these numbers come from? Do they have to be the same across all countries? Should they be different? And we've also heard some papers today, including some this afternoon, which have been suggesting that fixing discount rates has got some problems in itself. Sources of finance. I refer to this basically. I didn't. Some of the papers that I read in preparation to coming here, I felt were just treating costs and benefit flows in money terms as if the writers were writing about one single country. I mean, my training in cost-benefit analysis came about because I learned it in a national context where we've got no issues about cross-country comparison and country conversions. We've got one single national government which has kind of got issues about how does it rank things. And what we're trying to do in this exercise today here, I guess, is to try and provide for interested parties some ways of ranking as if what one had was a sort of international government that was around. So It does seem to me, and this is kind of reflects stuff I learned as a student, that when the funding for this comes from consumption or investment, there are different opportunity costs here. And of course, in many cases, funding may come from external sources. And of course, if it does, we shouldn't be trying to convert all currencies using one simple method. If a national donor just gives some of the money to a country to help it, then presumably the spot exchange rate is going to be the relevant measure of purchasing power in those contexts, not a PPP exchange rate. So I think we've got to be far more careful. There is a social cost of capital if we fund this from investment. So there are the points I made there. I did have a quick look at this paper by Elina and Jean. I thought this was an excellent example, as my colleagues have said. I think this was the paper where I once again began to think about whether the USA was the proper kind of long-term choice for this. I think we should be trying to find another country. We should be using some of the resources for trying to promote excellent best practice research done in those countries. That would be a very good rate of return. I think the other thing which I thought very strongly was the point that Lynn was making, which is usually in the past, sensitivity study was to do with parameter uncertainty. We were using the same method, but rather like in an estimation model, there was a sort of confidence interval surrounding each parameter we estimated. Whereas what we are talking about today in terms of sensitivity is largely different methods of estimating something. I think both of those are valid, and I think the standard one, uncertainty because of classical things, should be given a higher weighting, I think. And it seems to me that if you do the distribution methods, as in Monte Carlo analysis, and you present the audience with visual graphics of what you get from Monte Carlo, that's hugely informative and quite easy to see and understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger. I'd like to invite Professor George Psacharopoulos.
Thank you. Well, first of all, clear a confusion that was raised this morning outside. My name is George Psacharopoulos, and I have no relationship to George Papadopoulos. that is the most common name in Greece. Yes. Second, I feel a little bit embarrassed to have to comment on a paper. I somehow feel I'm a contributor. So, Lynn, what else can I say? It's a great paper. It's a major contribution to the empirical literature on assessing cost of benefit. A way to say it. But it has important implications for developing countries. And also, it gives us some leads for future research. Traditional cost-benefit analysis education estimates a rate of return similar to other projects by comparing the stream of future benefits to costs. Well, the org analysis told us to focus to make up for the general audience. So I will be excused if I present some elementary studies to you. But let me, I will talk in terms of rates of return rather than benefit cost ratios. The two indicators of assessing the project are equivalent, especially for education, because we have well-paid net earnings estimates. They do not intersect, so we do not have much more conclusions to have no internal rate of return. So there are several species of rates of return. That is the rate of return. When you have the quiz to investor is the individual or the state, and the private rate of return refers to the individual return. And then we have two other rates. One that I call narrow social rate of return, and another one we call wide social rate of return. What does this mean? Again, excuse me for the elementary example, but this is the case of a rate of return on a bank deposit of $100 in some days where you could get an annual interest of 5%. That is, it's a division of an annual flow of benefits on that. Now, the private rate of return is an annual differential between two adjacent education levels, and the cost of education, in this case, if there are 40 years of schooling, stands from that average. That's it. There is absolutely no question on how good or bad is a private rate of return. A private rate of return is the most robust case that we can use before we add the single else and now, the narrow social rate of return is more or less the same as the formula is the same as the private rate of return, with the exception that there is the cost of the direct cost of education, schools cost, and professors in the denominator. So necessarily, the social rate of return is lower than the private rate of return. Right? And again, I will not comment on your sensitivity analysis. Very what you did it. They refer to the case paper that did for the Education Commission, where low income countries that private rate of return as an overall average is 11%. Okay? Now, here comes the Holy Grail. Estimating the wide social rate of return has been described in the literature as a Holy Grail. A few years before he died, in one conference, what's your best estimate of a wide social rate of return? Don't sorry, I cannot cite it to you. I cannot give you a reference. I'm going to be harsh from that. This is what he said. But we know a lot about there are lots of normative effects measured. It's very difficult to incorporate the rate of why. So, Vincent, his colleagues' contribution is that he added the value of mortality to the health differential, thus raising the rate of return because of something in the numerator. And by the way, Mr. Kennedy mentioned another contribution of him that this is a very differential when we are talking about social return, we should take productivity differential. And I have studied a few years ago on the excessive differential having there a price differential between farmers and more or less indicated, multiplied by the price of rice to direct productivity. So this is one time match the two. And as a result of that condition, the 11% became 16%. So we have a case where we go from the solid base 16% private rate. Narrow social becomes 11%, but when we add the value reduction, we go to 16%. Well, so the benefit spread depending on the rate of return you are talking about. But the end of policy implication of this finding is that traditional penalty returns are gross underestimates of the true social wide rate of return. Now, here comes the what we do more. We can add more non-matter social implication, such as credit reduction. And Lochner and Moretti have done a lot of work on this. Yes, it is for the United States, but it could be incorporated. We put other benefits that we can monetize somehow. But at the same time, we must be careful not to overdo it. We have to avoid downtime. And part of the mortality reduction value is due to education. have another solid problem to reconsider the microfinance with tremendous high and social heterogeneity, which macro growth account, and we make a few saying we can sort of the education goal. Again, we don't no problem doing. And lastly, using appropriate methodology. And you have no idea how many tickets have been published around being laid in the talking about the research education, but are essentially ways not public so these are my remarks. Since it's not yet in the red, and I'm not about to be harmed.
You are.
Just one service to the profession. You can estimate the current rate of return by fitting the other function to cost profitability. That is very, very convenient. But it's not good for estimating social rate of return. So I to those of you who will be doing in the future an estimate to who will use it also. This like the graph really and take the inference. Only some way of doing it and discussion. Let me stop here. We're going to all the way around behind.
Thank you very much. So let's give the authors a chance to respond, starting with Dean. And Dean, I know you have to leave earlier, so yeah, whatever. But let's start with your reply first.
Well, I think it's quite clear that these comments are constructive and suggest both revisions to the paper we have and the research agenda that George responded to. So there's very, very helpful comments. You talk on a few specific things. Anil raised the question of female education and how we dealt with that. So our costing was for all kids, education, males and female, on the assumption that you wouldn't be doing a bunch of same-sex schools for girls. The health benefits were all estimated on the effects of female education on the health outcomes, and we checked this, average education, male education, looked at all those things, and overwhelmingly, and even more, I think, than in the literature, we found the effects of the female. The earnings effects, I'm sure George on this, but I believe those are effects for both sexes. So the benefit curves over time that we have are for female education benefits, because we're not attributing health gains to male education, and for both the costs of the both. So I think we actually will time to get that straight, but I think that's what we have done. On the question of the way combining these two studies, I would think that's probably quite feasible and would be quite interesting. And it goes very much in the direction that Lynn and George talked to, that there are these multiple dimensions of outcome in education. We focus mostly on earnings, where we can quantify lifetime stunting, lifetime mortality. I think it makes sense to push the lower bound of the returns quantitatively up, and then keep in mind the other dimensions of return. And keep in mind the rule of thumb that you said too, the primary walking parts. The question of heterogeneity, George and Anil pointed to that, and I see three sources of heterogeneity in education effects, estimates of education effects. One is true variation across countries, and the effects of a real year of education. education. Second is variation across methods that are used to estimate the effect of the year of quality of data and the quality of method. And the third is that a year of education is not a year of education. In the US, a year of education is about 900 hours. And it probably goes up to $1,300 in Japan. And that probably is the range for high-income countries, just about. But for low-income countries, it goes down to 300 or 400 or 500 hours. So we're talking about something totally different when we talk about years. So that's another source of heterogeneity we certainly did not take into account. Nor did we take true variation into account. What I think I can say something about is variation across methods. Methods we use for estimating the effect of education on mortality. So very substantial, I'm not sure there. We have cross-country time series data, and we have, when we just put education in, we get a very high estimate of the effects of education on mortality. When we have country fix these effects in, naturally, the effect of education on mortality goes down, and it goes down substantially. If you further add in country effects on the time trend, it goes down again much more substantially. And so the methods that we use to generate the numbers in this paper took both of those into account. And for that reason, our estimate of the effects of education on mortality are the absolute bottom of the very substantial. So I think it's conservative, but I also think it's closer to correct. So that's a major point. The double counting point that Lynn raised. I'm afraid I think we not only didn't, but need to take that into account with the revision of some of the calculations, and that will knock down somewhat the amount of the mortality effects and to the internal rate of check. But I think that's, I'm not enthusiastic about going back to anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. So now Brett would like to have a chance to respond to your comments. Right.
So I'd like to thank both of the four of the discussants for the comments. Certainly, there's some things that I have to go back and look at based on that. I'm not going to respond directly to all of the comments, just a few of the select ones. So Lynn mentioned that it was that this has never been done in Haiti, and there's some uncertainty about applying those estimates, the results from the Buddha study to the Haitian context. And when we did this project in Haiti, so just to give a little bit of background, is that we did about 40 cost-benefit analyses in Haiti across all of these different sectors: health, education, governance, agriculture, etc. When we went and did that, it was really, really tough because there were like hardly any good quality studies in Haiti. So randomized controlled trials, there was a few in health, and there was only one in agriculture that we found. The rest of them just had to be done kind of like this, where you just point together all the evidence that you have. And I think that that's sort of the reality of a lot of policy settings in the developing world. You just got to work with what you got. You can't just sort of that's still, at least the way we think about the Copenhagen consensus, that's better than all having only focusing on high quality studies. The other one that you mentioned was about account for uncertainty, and what is interesting, I didn't get to present this, and I really haven't done enough of the analysis to present it, but I might do it in a future version of the paper, is that the range of uncertainty was, say, you might go from net benefits, it might increase them by, we might double them, or it might increase them by half. So So there's a bit of uncertainty in terms of the effect on results. But when you compare the results to other uses of development money in the Haitian context, the difference between the average intervention, which is roughly around benefit cost ratio of 2, and the best intervention is actually an order of magnitude. So the best intervention in the Haitian context is like reflower fortification. That's one we found, and that has a benefit cost ratio around 24. Electricity reform has a benefit cost ratio around 22. So from a policymaker's perspective, when they're looking at a menu of interventions and all the different benefit cost ratios that are attached to them, I'm not sure, but I want to go check this. I don't think the effects of the valuation methods will change the relative rankings that much, because the difference between the relative rankings is like 1 order of magnitude. And in other countries, in Bangladesh, for example, we worked in, it was like 2 or 3 orders of magnitude difference in the relative effectiveness. So if you're a policymaker that's interested in finding out what are the best uses of development money, I don't think the valuation methods change what you actually end up doing, which I think is comforting, right? Well, let's see how that pans out. So, Roger, thank you for your comments as well. I would totally agree with you that the choice of discount rates is arbitrary, and we'll need to look very closely at Carl's paper and try and understand it and then apply what the right discount rates and it should be. But let me tell you that when we spoke to the Haitian officials, the first discount rate they gave us was 20%. So, and we had to talk that particular official downwards because we didn't feel that was really credible. But I don't think, if you think about it from their perspective, I'm not sure that 20% is it could be a reasonable thing to say from a Haitian government perspective. If you think about all the bad things that happened to Haiti, all the uncertainty, change of government, natural disasters that wipe out 1% of the population, agricultural yields in Haiti haven't increased for 50 years, and that's like you got to try really hard to not have your agricultural yields increase over that period of time, given all of the technology that's available since the 60s. So that's one comment about that, and basically all I'm trying to say is that we went and asked the Haitian government because we needed to legitimate the results to them. They were the end users of it. And so when we checked that, hey, it's 12% reasonable, they said yes, we felt confident that whatever we came back with would be listened. But when we said 35%, they kind of laughed at us. The point about sources of finance is well taken, and certainly I need to go back and look at and really deconstruct which parts come from in-country, which might be provided by donors, and adjust the cost that way, and really talk about cost today. Those are the comments. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Brad. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the audience? I know it's been a long day. If not, then here's a question. I'm sorry, Lisa.
No. I was just going to say a few words. Well, actually, so Frank was the question.
Sorry. As people are very interesting. We have worked on information data for some time in context. And a lot of data is collected in a household setting, do the surveys, get your weight scales, and take those measures at one point in time. But in the Haiti's context, the one you used, I just want to know what is the setting in which the data was collected, particularly because the errors in measurements are huge in case of collecting autonomic data. So was it more kind of clinic-based, and was it also over a period of time? I presume that you probably had before and after context in the data. And what I wanted to know is the objective of achieving better heights, for example, avoiding stunting, is a very complex outcome indicator. There are many mechanisms, the large number of variables which affect height growth. For example, in some of the data of the late 90s, we have evidence that it's the mother's education. At that time, the mother's education was low. Now things are improved in Indian context. So it was just the mother's education which was giving us the strongest results. The intervening variables, such as maybe good potable water, immunization, breastfeeding, and those are the intervening processes through which the height gain will occur. So I'm a bit, even if you would advise a government, okay, your objective should be to increase heights, I'm unable to conceive a specific program that a policymaker would choose to achieve that.
So thank you for your questions. The first one, how was it collected? It was collected during a DHS round in 2000. Well, it happened in 2012, or it finished in 2012, so I'm assuming it. Household survey. And I don't know enough about how household surveys are done to know exactly how that particular data was collected, but I'm assuming they used the proper techniques. In terms of the comment around how there are many factors in which affect height in a given country and policy setting. I totally agree with that. This intervention here is only 20% effective. It doesn't get rid of all stunting. John Hodman has done a lot of work that shows that in the Bangladeshi context, there's all sorts of other factors, and education of women is one, provision of clean drinking water is another component. So this particular intervention is, I guess, a pretty technical package that addresses partially the problem, and that's still worth doing a cost-benefit analysis on. And our research that others have done suggests that even though it only benefits 20% of the children, it's still a very effective use of funds, if not in the Haitian context, but in other.
Great. Thank you very much. In a great panel. Let's give it a round of applause to our panel. And I'd like to hand over the floor to Lisa, who would like to do the final remarks.